African countries may be under the delusion that they are doing better, but there are two elements that are crucial for us to face COVID-19 challenges. The first is that this virus tends to move geographically in waves. So the wave that is going to affect Africa is going to come later for a variety of reasons. And so one has to be ready for the peak in Africa to be much later than in other regions of the world. And the second deceiving impression that we may have is the fact that we have too little impact in terms of number of infected people and lethality of this virus. But in fact, it's because we are not testing enough. So we don't have enough information. Our data systems are poor. The capacities of different governments to respond partly have to depend on what kind of quality data they can generate. And in most African countries, we don't have really the quality data that is required, with a few exceptions, obviously. So it is very difficult for us to predict exactly when this is going to affect Africa, but there is one absolute understanding that we have to have, is that it's going to affect it very, very devastating, in a very devastating way. The economic impact is already there, partly because we're experiencing some characteristics in our structural economic problems that depend very much on commodities that precede COVID-19. For instance, the fact that there was a war, the oil prices that started some months back and then, hit the markets mostly in the last few weeks between Saudi Arabia and Russia, with consequences in other commodities. But if you look into those who measure the trends in terms of commodity prices, they have been going down for a while. And then you have other characteristics also that were worrisome, like the war between China and the US in the trade front was affecting demand of African products, mostly commodities, obviously, and was introducing in the market levels of unpredictability that were devastating our currencies. Volatility was at a whole point high, and we also were experiencing, increased debt, sovereign debt, as a result of difficulties accessing finance from traditional concessional sources. So these characteristics were already there. COVID-19 just exacerbates the trends and creates a stoppage of activities that are going to affect Africa deeply, more than other regions, for three specific reasons. The first one is because our logistics are extremely weak. So paralysis of world trade and paralysis of communications and transports affect Africa more than other regions. The second is because we have also a lot of informality in our economies. So a stoppage of activities creates incredible vulnerabilities with people that really depend on day-to-day activities to survive. And we really don't have the tradition of social distancing in any circumstances, and in this particular ones, it's going to be devastating. And then the third very specific characteristic of Africa is the fact that we have traditionally not been very good in actually utilizing the very small number of instruments that we have for stimulus packages. Like, for instance, we could tap much more on pension funds, but our pension funds are not very well organized, and most of them are not very productive, which is one source of money that governments could use better if it was properly managed. We have not been able to create the safety nets necessary for our banks, central banks in particular, to organize themselves in order to practice what others do in terms of monetary policies in times of crisis. Obviously, part of the problems that we have are the result of the fragility of our economies, but more are the result of bad management. So we have this combination of elements that are specific to Africa that puts us right in the middle of the crisis already now, even before we are hit from a sanitary point of view. I think having a moratorium on debt servicing is not enough, because basically it just postpones the problem, and we'll have to start repaying the debts in a period where, you know, we are expecting some recovery to take place. So that is really not the way to go. I think we have to have some degree of not debt forgiveness, but debt service forgiveness. Which is slightly different in the way it is presented, because it will give the impression that Africans are not trying to get away with not, being responsible and challenging all the gains that we have had so far in terms of our macroeconomic management. But I think we have to also have stimulus packages of the sorts. And it has to come in a combination of different instruments and tools. I expect that we'll need no less than $200 billion to be able to actually have an impact. And this is based on the size of GDP in Africa. And I think it's going to be difficult to mobilize this money, but when you think about what it represents, it's not that much. Just to give some examples, the entire package the IMF has put at the disposal of sub-Saharan African countries right now is about $14 billion. That is as much as the EU has approved for Portugal, which is a country of 10 million people. So this just gives an idea of the kind of size that we are talking. 200 billion is not that much at a world scale. And I think it is an effort that has one specific justification for those who have the means to be able to be persuaded. And the justification is that if we don't really maintain the level of response that is needed to combat the virus in Africa, Africa will transform itself into a repository of that virus, and therefore will be a threat for the rest of the world. I think we are experiencing a degree of openness that is quite remarkable. I think what the IMF has said about fiscal deficits, what the IMF has said about debt, the first measures that have been approved for the countries that have already accessed the emergency credit facility of the IMF, all are indications of a degree of openness that is revolutionary. And I think we have to admit that and acknowledge it. The World Bank has also put together a very comprehensive package. It is a bit slower in terms of disbursements, but it's getting there very quickly. And I think we can expect a similar openness on the part of international financial institutions like the World Bank. I'm a bit more disappointed with some of our bilateral donors that have important stakes in Africa. And I'm talking about the key ones, like the European Union, the Chinese, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey. I'm talking about all the ones that have, in the last few years, emerged as the most important investors in the continent. Some are new, some are more traditional, like, for instance, the US and Japan. From all these bilateral donors, we are not yet seeing a response. We are seeing a wait-and-see attitude, more concerned about their domestic challenges, which is understandable, but I hope they will raise to the challenge very quickly, because we really need a commensurate openness on the part of these actors. And I think when you read what the specialized media is saying about the needs from the African continent, and the African Union has just put out today a report on the economic impact and the needs of the continent, you can expect that some of these countries like the UK, like Japan, like the US, traditional donors together with the European Union, Canada, and others are going to be able to respond with a bit more of information that is being provided right now. The characteristics of a virus like the one we are confronted with is that they mutate and they create adaptations and new streams that basically take into account what they face. What we know from previous experience is that Africa has suffered immensely because of lack of preparedness and lack of knowledge. During the Spanish influenza about a century ago, the number of casualties in Africa is so colossal, but also so much unknown that if you go into history books, it will always present the Africa as a sort of a question mark, but people felt that it really stalled development for quite some time, and the consequences demographically were quite spectacular. I think we should be under no illusion that because of the youthness of the African population, we are going to have less effects. In fact, if we wanted to be smart, we would say that the possible immunity that is created by youthness should be used to tackle more aggressively the beginning of the spread. Because once you basically lose the battle at the very beginning, it becomes much more difficult to tackle it afterwards, because we don't have the health systems that will be capable to respond to the flow of people affected if we don't tackle it very early, using precisely our immunity resulting from youthness. Africa can benefit from this crisis in so far as it is prepared and grabs the opportunities that are going to be possible to grab. I'm thinking particularly in three. One is the fact that we now know better that dependency of the global value chains in one specific geography is not a very good security investment, and it's not a very good risk investment. So both countries, from security reasons, and corporations from risk perspective, are going to be very keen on spreading geographical coverage of their value chains, the ones they control, the ones they are the leaders. And I think that is an opportunity for Africa that is going to have a consumer market of 2 billion people soon. The second opportunity is that we have now witnessed the incredible benefits of technology to create new forms of work, new forms of economic transaction. And Africa was already innovating in some of these modalities like mobile banking and e-services in areas such as agriculture. But now we can see the benefits of doing the same in a range of other areas for which leapfrogging makes sense. And it's always easier to leapfrog when you are in a very low base than to retrofit when you already have an installed capacity. So this is an opportunity for countries that don't have means. For instance, let's say the example that everybody has in mind is health, to be able to access health services and health capabilities remotely. And then finally, I think the other opportunity that is being offered is that we are now going to witness a return to Keynesian policies, where the state becomes more central, where people accept that public services are going to be necessary as an investment, not just as a liability, where it will be more authorized from sort of a perspective of the markets, etc., that more investments are made on public goods. And I think Africa really it can benefit from this wave, The same way, just in the recent past, it could benefit from the fact that the prices of fossil fuels were matched by renewables in terms of production, distribution, and it was for the first time possible for a continent that is late in terms of access to, let's say, power and electricity, to move straight into renewables for the same cost. Now it's going to be the same, if you want, in terms of remote forms of work and remote delivery of services. I think in all countries in Africa are going to be deeply affected. Some that had very high growth can afford to have a cushion and still have some growth this year, not close to what they were achieving in the last decade, but still respectable given the circumstances. But the majority of the African countries, the bulk of the African countries is going to experience negative growth. And I think the ones that are most affected are the ones that have a very high degree of dependency of commodities that are going into historical lows. It's the case of oil, it's the case of a number of others. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult for these countries to deal with the combination of commodity prices going down in terms of prices, but also in terms of demand. And at the same time, have an increased budget deficit resulting from the investments that one has to make to combat COVID-19. So it's going to be an extremely difficult year, 2020, and I expect 21 to be equally difficult with a very slow recovery period.